All right.
Good evening, everybody. We'll get started here in just a second. We want to make sure folks have time to get into the virtual room. We much prefer to do these in person if we could. Actually, we've been trying to do these in person for the last year and a half, and obviously that hasn't happened. So appreciate your patience with this webinar version. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Nick Pinizzotto with the National Deer Association. We're very pleased to host this meeting here in the Southwest region to talk about a not so fun subject, understandably, chronic wasting disease, but a very important subject, and one that as a national conservation organization, we've been working on all across the country. And here we're obviously talking with you in Pennsylvania, which is a state, unfortunately, that has this disease. So I think we have a good program for you this evening. We want it to be, very informative, hopefully answer some of the questions that you might have about the disease, but also you have an opportunity to ask questions as well. In the last 30 minutes of the program here today will be devoted to your questions. And so I'll tell you to put those in the Q&A box in your screen there. You'll see at the bottom of your viewing screen, there'll be a Q&A tab. That's where you'll put your questions and answers. We also have a chat feature if you want to use that, but that's more for just general conversation. We won't be looking into there for questions for the Q&A. So just a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about this evening. So we're going to start off with an update from for your region. From there, we're going to hear from a national expert that works on this disease day in and day out. Then we're going to hear from, actually, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned Brian Richards will be our national expert from USGS. We'll hear from him. Kip Adams from the National Deer Association. We'll give an overview about CWD impacts on hunting. Andrea Corman from the Pennsylvania Game Commission will be presenting to you, talking about what the Game Commission is doing with this disease, and it's a lot. And then we'll take your questions and answers. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into it. And I want to start by introducing Samara Trousseau. She's the Southwest Region Wildlife Management Supervisor, and she's going to tell you a little bit about what's going on around the region. So Samara, the floor is yours.
Thanks. As Nick mentioned, I am the Wildlife Management Supervisor for the Game Commission Southwest Region. So let me just switch my screen over here and start my presentation for y'all. Did that work? Is that working? Here we go. Okay. And I know there's a way to turn off my video, but I'm not seeing it right now. Here we go. Okay. So I just want to give everybody that has joined us tonight, and thank you for coming, a quick background on CWD. Brian is going to go into the details about the disease, but I thought it was important for all of y'all in the audience to get some quick background on it. Chronic wasting disease is a disease of wild cervids in Pennsylvania. That's our elk and deer population. It is always fatal. There is unfortunately no vaccine or treatment for it, and looks can be deceiving. The disease takes 18 to 24 months or so to start showing symptoms in a given animal. And so the animal on the left, which looks very healthy, could in fact be CWD positive, where the animal on the right, although it is in fact wasted, is CWD negative. One of the reasons that we're particularly concerned about chronic wasting disease is because it's transmissible. So it can be transmitted from deer to deer through direct means, so direct contact from deer to deer, but it can also be transmitted through indirect means, which is basically environmental contamination, where CWD prions are shed in the saliva, urine, and feces of wild deer, and then those deer can pick it up out of the environment. Andrea is going to talk a little bit about the monitoring program and other management strategies we're doing in Pennsylvania, but just briefly, again, for context, the monitoring that we've done has included collecting samples from hunter harvested deer from both our bin system, but also from our extraction stations. We collect roadkill deer, and we also collect animals that we suspect of having chronic wasting disease, or we feel the importance for sampling for other reasons. For example, if we came across an animal in the wild that had ear tags suggesting it was an escapee from a captive cervid facility. So I'm talking just about what's going on here in the Southwest region tonight. And for those of you who are not familiar with this part of the state, we're talking about the 10 counties here outlined in yellow in the Southwest region part of the state. So first, I just want to touch on our bins. So we have bins throughout both areas of chronic wasting disease in this region. And this past year, from those bins, we were able to successfully collect 764 sampled heads. And those were from both of the DMAs that overlap with this region. You can see there that Armstrong brought in the fewest number of animals for us to sample, but don't harass Armstrong County. They are only a tiny little sliver of the DMA up there. And then from the other 4 counties, we collected quite a lot of samples. 133 on the low end from Westmoreland up to 236 from Cambria County. And again, those were heads that were given to us through the hunter harvest bin sampling. We also collect samples through extraction stations. So those are during firearm season. Those are randomly collected heads. So we send aging teams out to do sex age information from butchers that are processing deer during hunting season. And that means that we get heads from the entire region. And this year, we collected a total of 504 samples through our extraction station. And of those samples, 314 were specifically from DMAs in the Southwest region counties. We also collect roadkill deer. And actually, I can't remember if I said this in my previous slide. So I just want to show y'all up here, this gray section, that's DMA 3. And down here, this gray section, that's DMA 2. So when we're collecting roadkill deer samples, we're collecting from the entire DMAs right now. But in addition to those areas, we're collecting, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on this map, there's a yellow border area around the DMAs. And those are all townships that are within about 10 miles. And that's where we're collecting our roadkill deer. So within the DMA and in those townships that are within 10 miles of the boundary of a DMA. And so this year so far, we've collected 990 samples through that system, 282 from DMA 3 and 708 from DMA 2. So just a quick summary of what happened here in the region this year. For 2021, so far to date, we have collected a little over 2,200 samples for chronic wasting disease. Of those, almost 1,300 were hunter harvested, and about 1,000 of those were out of our DMA counties. About 990 roadkill, and 23 that fit into the other category. And this is probably something of particular interest to the audience, but out of all of those samples so far this year in our sampling, we've only had 1 wild positive in DMA2. And again, I hope you can see my cursor, but down here at the corner, the eastern corner of Somerset County is where we had that positive. And then I just have one quick last but not least, we have 3 DMAP units that are related to our CWD management program in this region. One is up here on the Indiana County border, one is in Cambria County, and one is in Westmoreland County. And those are areas where we're hoping to bring the numbers of deer down in particular a little bit, but also to collect extra samples. So we hope that folks that are harvesting animals using those DMAP units are also dropping the heads. And I think that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samara. Appreciate that update to Southwest region. I should have noted here from the National Deer Association side, Kip Adams and I also happen to be Pennsylvania natives, and we're talking to you from Pennsylvania, and I'm in the Southwest region in Indiana County, and I actually have property in the disease management by those head bins yesterday. So this is very real for all of us. And so you're not alone, I guess is what I would say there. Mr. Brian Richards is with us from USGS. He's a wildlife biologist there at the National Wildlife Health Center. And Brian is going to give us a national overview. And there's no one better to give this talk than you, Brian. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
All right. Thank you, Nick. And I just want to messing around, same thing. I wasn't sure I could share my screen, but theoretically you should be looking at at my screen with some wood betony in the background there. Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
All right, we are good to go then. All right, so thanks again. Let me see, Nick, I can't see how to, okay, stop. How do I mute my camera when it's over on the side? Interesting question, huh?
There are 3 little dots towards the top of that screen. There should be on the side, and you should be able to click the
Stop
turn
video.
off camera.
Perfect.
All right, did that shut it off for you?
Yep.
All right, sounds good. All right, so good evening, and thanks, Nick. And my name is Brian Richards. I'm a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey's National Wildlife Health Center in Madison, Wisconsin. Our science center, which is pictured here, conducts diagnostic and wildlife disease research, and we provide epidemiological and technical assistance to states, tribes, and federal partners. We're rather unique. We're the only federal facility with a focus on wildlife health, and that's solely for the benefit of wildlife. Also, we're recognized by the World Organization for Animal Health as a collaborating center for wildlife health and biodiversity, and also more recently by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations as a reference center for wildlife health and wildlife disease diagnostics. We've been around at the center since 1975, and since that time, we've been involved with a number of pretty high-profile, important wildlife disease issues. I've not had an opportunity to update this slide recently. Otherwise, it shows some newer emerging disease threats, including rabbit hemorrhagic disease and SARS-CoV-2 and the impacts in wildlife. We've been involved with chronic wasting disease since 2002, immediately after it was detected in the state of Wisconsin. And I personally have been at the center since 2004, and I was with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for a little over a decade prior to that. This evening, I'll be giving you a real short primer, an update on CWD in North America. But before I'd start, I would like to thank the sponsors, the National Deer Association, Pennsylvania Game Commission, and the Penn Wildlife Futures Program for sponsoring this event. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for taking the time and effort to attend. So sometimes I struggle with how to begin an overview like this. So I decided why not look at something in the news. And so here's an article by Marcus Schneck. It was published a couple of weeks ago in Penn Live. It starts out, deer killed by hunters in the last hunting season in Pennsylvania's hot zone for CWD were found to be infected at a rate of 14%, which is up from 8% the previous year. Pennsylvania Game Commission tested more than 12,000 whitetails for CWD this last year. It's a great number. But a total of 218 of those deer were found to have CWD, a number that Matthew Schnupp, director of the Commission's Bureau of Wildlife Management, described as a punch in the stomach for wildlife managers and hunters. Commissioner Timothy Layton said the only hope for making things better in the established area and for keeping CWD at bay elsewhere in the state is for hunters to help wildlife managers. And the author continued, hunter resistance to deer reduction efforts can be a stumbling block to efforts to battle the disease. Pretty interesting article and sage words. So to summarize, CWD seems to have a pretty good foothold in Pennsylvania, and it's likely getting worse. Management efforts, at least so far, based on the numbers, don't seem to be working all that well. And it includes that if hunters don't support and actively engage in management, that's not likely to change. In fact, CWD will likely continue to grow and spread to other areas of the state. Now, that's not designed to be any sort of a scare tactic. It's a reality that's been experienced over and over again in other states and provinces. And unfortunately, the road you seem to be headed down right now will likely lead to a lot more of those punches to the stomach. So let's start with a few observations about CWD. What's it doing? It's spreading geographically, both nationally and in Pennsylvania. Prevalence, or the proportion of the population affected with CWD, is growing in many locations, including in your state. It kills some deer directly, but what may be more important is that CWD results in a progressive neurological degeneration and thus predisposes deer to other sources of mortality, like getting hit by a car, an arrow, or even a bullet. Whatever the ultimate cause, deer with CWD tend to die much sooner than they would have otherwise. And some of the consequences of CWD. First, it's expensive. every facet of CWD costs real dollars to natural resource agencies, including the Game Commission. On top of that, CWD has tended to erode stakeholder trust in their management agencies. In the longer term, there can be other pretty substantial impacts to deer themselves. Deer populations tend to suffer over the long term. Initially, you might start seeing a decline in harvestable surplus. That's a segment of the population you hunt every year. And in a few areas with very high prevalence and protracted disease, CWD has actually been demonstrated to drive population decline. Demographic shifts are also likely to occur. So if your goal where you hunt and live is to produce older aged animals, those often managed for and desired by hunters, you're likely to not be able to sustain that goal. Hunter behavior is also predicted to change. If you hunt in an area with high prevalence, maybe in that 30, 40, 50% range, either you or a family member may change your hunting behavior, either choosing to hunt elsewhere or stop deer hunting altogether. And that'll circle back to the ability of the Game Commission to manage not only deer, but all the other resources that rely on hunting license dollars. So every presentation should have a picture of a deer with CWD. There was one in the first presentation. So here's mine, maybe. I can't tell you whether this deer has CWD or not. I would argue nobody can by looking at it. Deer with CWD looks perfectly normal for many, many months before it starts to develop that classical wasting appearance. But if this deer has CWD, she's actively shedding infectious agent into the environment, and she's capable of infecting other deer, but she looks just fine. So this is one of the issues that natural resource managers have with chronic wasting disease. Many hunters, even in hard-hit areas, have never seen a deer in the clinical phase of CWD, so it's hard to fathom that this silent killer is really out there, but it is. This slide lists some of the characteristics of CWD. It's a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, same category of diseases, which include Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans and bovine spongiform encephalopathy in cattle. Hallmarks of all TSCs include a long incubation period, progressive neurological degeneration, a relatively brief clinical phase followed by death. CWD and its cousin scrapie in sheep are unique among TSCs in that diseased animals shed infectious agent via bodily fluids like saliva, urine, feces, and can directly infect other herd or flock members. Deer become infected by ingesting or inhaling infectious agent. That transmission can be via direct contact or indirect with a contaminated environmental fomite in between. Vertical or doe to fawn transmission prior to birth has been documented and plays an unknown role in nature. Incubation period, protracted, followed by a brief clinical phase. Infected animals shed infectious agent long before the onset of clinical disease, and those shed prions can persist in the environment for years, maybe decades, and serve as a reservoir of infectivity for other animals. We tend to see higher infection rate in males and in older age classes of each sex. We can test for disease in live deer, but it's challenging. The majority of surveillance samples are collected from hunter-killed animals post-mortem. At this time, management tools are pretty limited, and there's little evidence of widespread genetic resistance. So the combination of these characteristics makes CWD extremely challenging to manage in free-ranging populations. So what does CWD do to an individual deer? Well, as noted before, CWD is a death sentence for every deer that gets it. If disease runs its full course, it's likely a couple years on average. But due to that progressive neurological degeneration, most CWD positive deer die of some other factor, and they die even sooner. Well, that's the very basics of what CWD is and what it does to deer. So why care? There's a lot of deer out there, right? In 2016, Drs. John Fisher and Mike Miller presented a paper at the North American Natural Resources Conference where they described the first 50 years of our experience with CWD. In it, they posed two overarching reasons why we might be concerned about CWD. First, CWD in the long run is very hard on deer populations. And the second is that we cannot absolutely rule out that CWD could someday become a human health issue. That remains an open question, but not consuming venison from CWD positive deer is what human health experts recommend. I'm going to go through some of the data and the science regarding what CWD might be doing at the population level to cervids, or members of the deer family. So here is the current documented distribution of CWD in North America. It's been detected in 26 states, 3 Canadian provinces in free-ranging and or commercial captive facilities. On the captive side, CWD has been detected in approximately 150 facilities in the US and 128 in Canada. On this map, the polygons represent CWD in wild deer, elk, and moose, and the dots represent captive deer operations where CWD has been detected. CWD has also been documented in South Korea, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. So clearly, this disease has a substantial footprint here in North America, both in wild and captive deer. So let's go back in time a little bit. I chose this one, it was 2005. So this was just a few years after CWD was detected in Wisconsin in 2002. And it's right after CWD was detected both in New York and West Virginia. Things look quite a bit different on that map than they do today. So let's move ahead a few years. Here's 2013, right after Pennsylvania had announced their initial detections in wild deer. And a single captive deer farm had been detected in Pennsylvania at that time. I think that was in 2012. And here we are back at the current time. Pennsylvania and the rest of North America looks quite different than it did a mere 8 years ago. Now I'm going to hone in on this is right after your initial detection in 2012. And again, CWD had always also been documented in West Virginia, Maryland, and a single county in Virginia. Plus, there was that initial captive facility over in Adams County. Now, again, back to the current time. CWD has been detected in wild deer, and I believe it's 14 counties in Pennsylvania and more to the south as well. It's also been confirmed in 28 captive deer facilities in Pennsylvania. That's by my count. It could be off by a couple. It's really important to note that this map includes an entire county, even if there is only a single wild positive in that county. That's the level of data I have access to. And at the national level, it's fine to portray it that way. But when you zoom into smaller areas, it does tend to exaggerate where CWD has been confirmed. All that being said, the way CWD tends to spread, it may not be an exaggeration for all that long. Now I'm going to show you a bit of data from my home state of Wisconsin. The red squares are 1 mile sections where CWD has been confirmed in 1 or more hunter-killed deer. CWD was first confirmed in Wisconsin in 2002, and they conducted literally a massive amount of surveillance in the next few years. Over 40,000 samples were collected in 2002 alone. Those are primarily hunter-killed deer. So this map is, I believe, is a pretty good approximation of where CWD was in 2005. Now up to the current time. CWD was detected in 1,578 deer, 1,578 deer in Wisconsin last year alone. Just out of, and that was out of just under 19,000 samples that were collected from hunters last year. Remember, you had 218 positive out of 12,000 samples in Pennsylvania last year. CWD has now been picked up in 32 of 72 counties in Wisconsin in wild deer, and that's in something over 8,000 individual positive wild deer. Another thing to consider, sampling is voluntary in Wisconsin. So what's been detected is a subset of the actual number of positive deer killed by hunters, and certainly what exists today in the wild. Plus, we have 29 captive facilities where CWD has been detected in Wisconsin. So looking at that series of maps, I would argue there's been a pretty dramatic expansion in CWD's footprint nationally, in my home state of Wisconsin, also in Pennsylvania. But what about prevalence? Is disease increasing as well as spreading? Let's take a look. Again, here's Wisconsin. And those 3 red dots in the southwestern part of the state are areas where CWD is performing very well. Now let's zoom in on one of the prevalence charts. The curves on these charts represent the proportion of deer that tested positive and how that changed or increased over time. You can see in this zone, CWD was essentially non-existent back in 2002 and really for the next several years. Then it really took off. Seems around 2010 to 2012, it hit an inflection point and really took off. Now, if you shoot a mature buck in this zone, it's literally 50-50 odds that that deer has CWD. So 1 in 3 odds in adult does and yearling bucks, and 1 in 5 in yearling does. Prevalence has risen dramatically in this area. Here's an image I took yesterday from the Game Commission website showing CWD test results. I believe this shows results for all samples collected for last year. So the reported percent positive is pretty small, less than 2%. But what I find interesting is take a look at that rate of growth in the bar chart on the lower right. The rate of detecting CWD positives is increasing rapidly. This time I selected adult males and just hunter-killed deer. I'm not sure again what the geographic extent is. Perhaps it's just the CWD DMUs. Now you're up to almost 5% prevalence. And we'd expect that, as adult males are more likely to be CWD positive than other herd segments. But look at that growth trend in the lower right. I just sketched an exponential growth curve over the top of the chart. And without doing a statistical analysis, I can't do the exact fit, but the fit looks pretty good. So unfortunately, I think your own data argues that CWD is performing pretty well in your core area, and in a fashion very similar to that we've observed in Wisconsin and Alberta and Saskatchewan, and the list would just kind of go on. And why wouldn't it? I'd ask the question, what's Pennsylvania doing today? And what are you doing, or what are you willing to do tomorrow to alter that trend and that outcome? Earlier, I mentioned one of the potential long-term outcomes is hunters changing their behavior in CWD zones. This is an interesting text here. A good friend of mine is very active in both the CWD world and social media. He's got a lot of folks that follow his activities. He started soliciting what he refers to as CWD stories from some of his contributors. And here's one from the very core of the CWD area in Wisconsin. So in 2014, a group of hunting buddies leased 280 acres, and this is absolutely in the heart of CWD land. They leased the ground for 4 seasons. In that time frame, every single buck they killed was CWD positive. Every single one. Killed a dozen or more CWD positive deer in 4 years. It became so bad that we gave up the lease and checked out. We couldn't stand shooting the deer and not being able to eat them. That's pretty sobering. I can't imagine wanting to help, to go hunting there myself if the situation's like that. So what can be done about CWD? And what's the Commonwealth willing to do? And remember that statement coming from Commissioner Layton about needing hunter support. I have to insert a caveat here when discussing management options. Pennsylvania is not my home state. I have no management prerogative or authority in your state or anywhere else for that matter. I cannot tell you what to do. That's your choice and not mine. But there are some opportunities. So I see it as kind of a 2-part story. First, if you don't have CWD, you might want to consider doing everything you can to keep it that way. You do have some control here. First, identify all the possible ways that CWD could come to you, and people are involved in most of them, and then implement regulations to stop those processes. But regulations on their own are likely not enough. Providing information and education to stakeholders is necessary. A well-informed populace is more likely to make better choices and reduce risk. Another caveat, if you're really close to where CWD is in the wild, those precautionary measures will be less effective. You might be able to get hunters to stop moving CWD, but deer will continue to move it themselves, and that's harder to address. Part 2, if you have CWD, do something about it. But do it in measurable, meaningful ways that can alter disease outcomes. So here's an example. Pennsylvania is doing a lot of disease surveillance right now, and that's fantastic. Learning about CWD and how it's performing on the landscape is an excellent idea. But surveillance itself is not active disease management. Surveillance is watching, but it does not alter disease outcomes. Early on, I mentioned that the CWD toolbox does not seem to have a lot in it. Well, what would a really full toolbox look like? For CWD, here's some of the tools I think would be really useful, and maybe someday we'll have them, but we don't today, and we likely might not for a long time to come. There's ongoing research into vaccines, but we're likely years away. And even with the vaccine, we have a pretty significant logistical hurdle delivering it to millions of deer across such a large swath of North America. How about genetic resistance? There's ongoing work here as well, but to date, there's no genotype identified that is truly resistant to CWD. They all seem to get CWD. Some just live longer with the disease than others. And once again, how do we produce enough to alter genetic composition at the population level in the wild? Disinfectants, both for use with tools, surfaces, vehicles, and to mitigate environmental contamination in the wild. That would be huge. If we could somehow identify whether a deer has CWD remotely and then selectively remove only positives, we could really start to alter outcomes. But I'd suggest don't hold your breath on that one. And better tests, especially ones where we can determine whether CWD is or is not in an area without ever testing a deer. Science is making progress on that one. But again, just knowing where disease is does not alter outcomes. It's still watching, but with a lot better tools. So again, we don't have these tools today, but I'd still argue it makes a lot of sense to do what you can to address CWD now, and it'll be simpler to use these tools if and when they are developed. So what do we have for tools today? Essentially, we have the same ones we've had for a very long time: lethal removal of animals from affected populations, both inside fences and in the wild. There are different ways to use this tool depending on your situation and goals. We won't go into a lot of detail right here, but this tool is one that is the one that does hold promise if wielded in an aggressive, sustained, and targeted manner. Last 2 points I think are really important as well. Are there any impediments to removing deer in Pennsylvania today? Are there seasons, bag limits, and restrictions on any group or cohort of deer that prevent willing hunters and landowners from taking this task on? And are there any mechanisms that the Commonwealth could adopt that might compel reluctant stakeholders to participate? Experience suggests that you will have to think outside the box to be successful with this disease. Good news is you don't have to start from scratch. Here's 2 resources I highly recommend. AFWA, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, recently published a set of best management practices. And the Western states and provinces, who've been dealing with CWD longer than anyone, published a set of adaptive management guidelines a few years ago. These are available online. I'd encourage anyone interested in CWD to take a look at them. Here's at the core of the best management practices for actively dealing with CWD in the wild. They make sense and they represent what science and experience offer. First, targeting the deer most likely to have CWD. Remember, that begins with the adult males. Next, targeting animals in CWD hotspots. It's kind of like putting out a campfire before it shoots sparks out and lights the forest on fire. Adjust season timing. Again, do you have open hunting in the peak of the rut when the males are most vulnerable? Do you allow the most efficient weapons to be used at that time? Are there limits on the number and kind of deer that hunters can take? Reducing density in CWD zones. The lower the population, the lower the number of the positives. Lowering density likely will not reduce prevalence, at least in the short run, but it will reduce the number of positives on the landscape. And from a disease perspective, that's a good thing. And eliminating any practices that congregate deer. Baiting, feeding, lures, both natural and artificial, are all designed to attract deer to a specific place and time, and all enhance the risk of deer-to-deer transmission. So we have tools that can be employed, but when we look at the maps and the prevalence curves, it doesn't seem like we're having that much success. Why is that? This is a photo of Aldo Leopold. He's known as the father of wildlife management and was a prolific writer. I suggest if you're interested, pick up a copy of his writings entitled A Sand County Almanac. If you're into wildlife and ethically managing the land, you'll really enjoy this one. Leopold identified wildlife management as a 3-legged stool. You have to have all 3 legs to be successful. And even in 1943, he recognized that people management was the hardest of the 3 legs. CWD is a prime example of this. Jordan Pachenik is a retired social scientist from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He was a human dimensions specialist. These next few slides are from a talk he gave shortly before he retired and are based on over 15 years of working with stakeholders on CWD in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin and elsewhere, including Pennsylvania, when CWD is initially detected, there's a lot of support for actively addressing CWD. After all, it's the Game Commission's mission to provide healthy wildlife. Landowners don't want CWD, and hunters generally support some measures to harvest more deer. But there's a caveat. They have to be convinced that their individual efforts will make a difference. And even if there's strong support initially, it tends to wane over time. Why? Well, it turns out there's a host of what Jordan called restraining forces that push back against the will to support active CWD management, and eventually they overwhelm. Things like sharpshooting and bounties for deer are simply not popular. Evidence. Remember how few hunters have actually seen a CWD positive deer in clinical phase? Hunter ethic. Many hunt for sport and tradition, and asking them to be disease managers it's hard. And even if they are willing, hunters have a personal consumption limit, and they're unlikely to harvest a lot of extra deer if they cannot use them. Many are not in favor of the type of population reduction that might be necessary to alter outcomes. Doubt. This creeps in over time. And there's a lot of alternative theories floating around on the internet and social media that help fuel doubt. And what about risk? Many believe there's little to no risk to either deer or humans. So we begin with attitudinal support. Nobody wants CWD. What we lack is behavioral support. Attitudinal support has failed to translate into sustained behavioral support for actively and aggressively managing CWD in many places over and over again. So what are the issues at hand? Keeping CWD from moving farther across your state and North America, managing the disease where it is today in ways that can alter outcomes, managing CWD in the commercial captive cervid industry, identifying risk factors, pathways for disease movement, and managing those factors, misinformation. We live in a society where misinformation can thrive and move very rapidly and influence a lot of stakeholders. And if those stakeholders do not support the Game Commission, actively support the Game Commission, the trends you are already documenting, I would argue, are very likely to continue. So I'm going to finish up right where I started. The data don't look promising right now, but I would argue you can turn it around. CWD can be managed, but it will not be simple. Outcomes can be altered, but it will not be quick. CWD management is not some sort of a la carte menu. Enacting a small handful of simple measures is simply not likely to alter outcomes. I would argue Commissioner Layton absolutely nailed it. The only hope for making things better is for hunters to help wildlife managers. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. And I believe we're going to take questions later on. And with that, Nick, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sorry, I was taking a second reading your cartoon there. Thank you, Brian. Much appreciated. Just a lot of tremendous information. Incidentally, before we go to Kip here, I noticed our crowd has built up here as we've gone on through the evening, which is great. If you weren't on whenever we started, I had mentioned, and I also put in the chat, to get your questions in the questions and answers tab at the bottom of your screen. And that's where we'll be pulling them later. So get your questions in there, please. With that, we're going to turn it over to Kip Adams. Kip is the Chief Conservation Officer at the National Deer Association, also a Pennsylvania native, although in the North Central. And he has plenty of experience on this issue, but in particular Pennsylvania, and he's going to talk about some specifics to Pennsylvania now. So Kip, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Nick. I appreciate that. Hope everybody is doing well so far. Certainly appreciate what Samara gave us relative to the Southwest region, and then Brian's overview of the science of this and how this is spreading. My take on this now is, or my part of this is, I'm going to take the science portion of what Brian shared and relate it to hunters and talk about the implications to hunters. It's one thing to understand the science of this and to know what this is doing. And I think it's very helpful if we can then take the next step and see, okay, what does this exactly mean for me as a hunter? I've been very blessed. I've been a wildlife biologist for over 25 years now, but I'll say this, I am first and foremost a deer hunter. And I like to be with deer hunters. I like to talk with deer hunters. And I agree that with Commissioner Layton's statement there that the hunters are the ones that are going to help us save this. I think the Pennsylvania Game Commission has a tremendous plan for this. But to be able to effectively do that, we need hunters to execute it. And that's why I'm proud to be part of this series of webinars and for the hunters to be here tonight to learn what they can do to take their part to absolutely fight this and win it. Because I do believe we can beat this disease. It's going to take all of us, but deer hunters have come to the rescue before, and I think we're going to again. So we're going to start here for a second and just talk about some of the value of deer and what deer really means to us. And if anybody here, I'm guessing most people here are deer hunters, so they understand some of this, but just to highlight the importance of deer, we know that about 79% of American hunters pursue deer, which is pretty cool. And this is way more than other hunters for species. We know that there's somewhere around 11 million deer hunters. And to put this into perspective, there's only about 3 million turkey hunters. And turkey hunters are the second most common hunters out there. So by reflection, there's only about 1.5 million duck hunters, and there's less than 1 million elk hunters. Now, it's not to say that these other hunters aren't important, and I love to hunt elk, ducks, and turkeys as well. But in the big scheme of things, there are about 4 times more deer hunters than the next most hunted species. And what this means is that deer hunters, we simply drive the hunting industry. There's a lot that happens in our wildlife management world that comes off the back of deer hunters. Deer are by far the most sought after game species. And we know that deer hunters contribute about 60% of the entire 37 billion that's generated from hunting. And that's billion with a B. That's a big deal. If we look specifically at Pennsylvania, we know that hunting contributes over $1.5 billion to our economy annually. So deer hunting is a big thing. And what this means is that certainly if you're a deer hunter in Pennsylvania, this is very important to you, but the deer impact a lot more than just our hunters here. They impact the hunters, they impact the non-hunters, they impact all of our citizenry. So deer, having healthy deer far into the future is an extremely important item, regardless if you're a deer hunter or not. Well, we know that there's a lot of things that the CWD can impact. Hunters are often, at the heart of all of this. And that's because if you take a look here, these are the species that are impacted. These are things that people love to hunt. We can't hunt all of these here, obviously, in Pennsylvania, but across North America, we know that CWD can impact mule deer and elk and black-tailed deer and white-tailed deer and moose and reindeer and all these things that we love to pursue. Are there others? Man, there certainly might be. There may be other things that we like to hunt, or just things that we like to photograph or just watch or just know that exist on wildlife that we don't hunt. So this is not just a disease of deer, it's infecting other cervids as well. But from a hunting perspective, this is a really big deal, and this is one of the reasons why. From a CWD information standpoint, I think Samara and Brian both did a great job explaining the science of it. And if I'm thinking of this strictly from a hunting end, it really boils down to some 3 pretty important things. We know there's no vaccine, there's no cure, it's 100% fatal to all whitetails. If you're a hunter, even if you didn't follow all of the science, this is pretty clear to see that, you know what, if you like deer, this is not a good deal. And specifically talking about white-tailed deer, we know that the probability of infection increases with age in both bucks and does, and adult bucks are about twice as likely to be infected. So none of these are good for the future. They may, right where you live or hunt now, this might not be impacting it that badly, but once it's in the herd, it is not good at all for the future. It's going to catch up to them. So our job is to stop it before it does. I share this picture with you. This was one of the first 3 cases of CWD that were found in wild deer, and this is near Mount Horeb in Wisconsin. This is back in 2001. And I share this because, people often see pictures of deer that are wasted away and say, okay, this deer has it. Samara and Brian both also showed pictures of very healthy looking deer that had CWD or could have had it. And I share this because I think this really drives the point home. We can take a look at this deer and see how it's just wasted away. It's very thin. You wouldn't look at this and think this is very healthy. However, take a look at the antlers. What this means is this deer at least was very healthy during the antler growing portion of the summer. So in the spring, must obviously had CWD, but wasn't showing symptoms. And through about the 150 days that the antlers grow, obviously this deer was still extremely healthy to be able to do this. It was only after this deer shed its velvet that it really started going downhill. And Brian impressed upon us that the average incubation period, was 18 to 24 months. So these deer can look perfectly normal while they have the disease and while they're shedding these infectious materials and infecting other deer. However, once they start showing symptoms, they do go downhill very rapidly. But I want to make sure that all the hunters here realize that almost none of us are going to ever see a deer that has wasted away. It's very clear from the research that if a deer has CWD, even if it's showing those symptoms, it's 2 to 3 times more likely to die than the deer that doesn't have it. They're going to die to, bullets and Buicks and arrows and predators and that type of thing. And some folks say, well, you know what, if it's going to die, to something else, I'm okay with that. And I don't think that we should be. If you take a look at anything else that you like, whether it's songbirds, turkeys, squirrels, bear, or anything else that you may hunt, if there's a certain segment of that population that's 2 to 3 times more likely to die this year, just because it has something, that it's obviously not a good thing for the future. So not a good thing for deer at all. But this is also why most hunters need to realize that they're not going to see all these dead deer laying in the woods everywhere. Unfortunately, they died of something else first. And this picture shows that pretty clearly, given the great antler development that it had here during the growing season. So from a hunting end, how does CWD introduced into a new area? Well, one of the biggest ways is movement of an infected captive deer. And I share this, and this is a map from Pennsylvania. This is over a 10-year period. This is all of the known, legal, reported movements of deer between captive facilities in the state. This is, if it looks like crayons, this is just drawn all over the place. Now we know that there's not a reliable and practical live animal test yet. Fortunately, science is getting very close to that, but there's not something we can use yet. So since we can't tell that a deer has the disease by looking at it, unfortunately, we inadvertently have moved a lot of deer that just had the disease to a new place. So this is one of the easiest ways that we are moving the disease. Now, this is not a talk to bash captive deer facilities by any means. We know that is a realistic way, so I talk about it. Another way that we know that these are moving is by immigration of an infected wild deer. We know in Pennsylvania that 1/2 to 3/4 of our yearling bucks are going to disperse. They're going to disperse 1 to 5 miles, somewhere between 12 and 18 months of age. And if they have the disease, they're taking it with them and have the opportunity to then infect deer in a new area. And we also know that contact with the remains of an infected deer can spread this disease. Now, this is from a hunting perspective too. What this means is if we move the high-risk parts of a deer that we've shot, high-risk parts being the eyes, the brain, the spleen, the backbone, if that deer has CWD and we take those parts, move them to a new area, discard them on the landscape, other deer that come in contact with that can then contract the disease. So I want to make sure hunters realize from a hunting end, this is why the Game Commission has restrictions on what you can take out of disease zones. This is why a lot of states have restrictions on being able to move these high-risk parts, across state lines. They don't want deer, coming in, or these high-risk parts coming into their borders. And that's a good thing. As hunters, is it an inconvenience for us to have to debone our deer before we move them? It absolutely is. But you know what? At the end of the day, I told you I'm a diehard deer hunter. It's an inconvenience that is absolutely worth it to me to safeguard the futures of our deer. If I have to take a little extra time and leave the backbone behind and debone that deer, then if I can help assure the future health of deer herds, then I'm absolutely willing to do that. And I'm glad that the Game Commission doesn't allow movement of these parts out of the disease zones. And we'll talk a little more about that when we come. But before I leave this slide, I want to make sure that the folks know that by far, the 2 best things we can do to limit the spread of this disease is to stop moving live deer and to stop moving the high-risk parts of deer that we shoot during hunting seasons. So we all can do something to help from that end. All right, now let's look specifically at what we have impacts from CWD on hunters and on society. Well, we know that in most cases, once we have the disease, population reduction is in order. And this is never a popular thing with hunters because we want to see deer. And I'm the same way. When I go hunting, I want to see a lot of deer. I never go hunting and say, man, I hope I see fewer deer today than I did yesterday. That's just not in our DNA to think that way. But hopefully we need to understand the value of reducing these deer herds so we can limit spread of the disease. So one of the things we often see, and if you're from Pennsylvania, and I'm looking at the attendees list, so I know there's numerous folks on here from outside of Pennsylvania, but regardless of where you're from, if your state wildlife agency is asking you to reduce this deer herd, that's a good thing because deer herds typically have to be reduced in many cases below what those habitats can support to limit contact and transfer among those animals to help limit the spread of this disease. So hopefully this is more of a short-term solution that we have to allow us to get our hands around this disease. But it's very clear if we don't do something about it now and allow these deer herds to remain high, then the disease will spread much more quickly and we're going to be in an even worse scenario. So reducing deer herds in disease zones is a very, very good thing. We also know that from a hunting end, impacts on us, once you get CWD, it's basically the end of deer season as you know it. A lot of us are very traditional when it comes to how we hunt. particularly those here from Pennsylvania. I grew up in a very traditional northern Pennsylvania deer camp, still very fortunate to hunt out of that camp today. So I know how hard-headed hunters can be and how much we like to have opening day be exactly the same day and be able to go to exactly the same spot and have the same people in camp. And man, when you get CWD, all that goes out the window. You end up now with CWD check stations. You end up having to provide samples, which is a good thing, but it's certainly a difference when you're taking home a headless deer. All of a sudden somebody looks at that, or they see that in the back of your truck, or you got to make sure you get enough pictures before you take that head off. Is it different? It absolutely is different. But I want to make sure that I impress upon folks that it absolutely is necessary. We also know from a hunting end that once you have CWD, you can expect movement regulations. We don't want to move those high-risk parts out of disease zones. We often have longer hunting seasons. We have additional hunting seasons. We have sharpshooting. We have targeted removal. All of these other things come in that we initially really want to restrict and say, no, this doesn't feel right. But we need to understand the value of all of these and how they play in and how these are helping make sure that we have deer to hunt long into the future. We have a loss of privileges once CWD arrives. No more feeding, no more baiting, no using minerals, no urine attractants. We don't want to congregate deer. And regardless of how you feel about any of these, science is very, very clear that these places congregate deer and make it far easier for the disease to spread. So we don't want to do that. So if you like to do camera surveys over corn piles in summer before deer season gets here, to be able to identify numbers of deer, this is a great technique for a formal survey. People across the whitetails range use this. Once you have CWD, though, this goes out the window, and for good reason. There's no more using salt or minerals for capturing pictures of deer. I'm a huge trail cam fan. I love to use them. I run cameras year round, and I know folks all through Pennsylvania and other states that do. But we need to understand the reason. The Game Commission is not telling us that we can't do this because they want to be mean. They're telling us because we don't want animals in here swap and spit at these bait piles. A good friend of mine, former deer biologist, and now has moved up in the chain at the Missouri Department of Conservation, has an excellent photo trail camera of a deer, CWD positive deer, standing in a mineral lick, drooling into the lick with sets of other deer eyeballs right behind it, just waiting for it to leave to come in so they can get a lick there. And the thing is, we know that this disease is transferred through saliva. So it's just a hot spot, just waiting to infect other deer. So you need to understand, this is why these type of things are outlawed and to help protect the deer that are left. In CWD zones, mature bucks are not encouraged. We don't want to see this, and Brian talked about this. He showed you those curves on the graph, and I'll show you some similar ones here in a minute. But the reason being, we want to drive age structures younger because younger deer have lower limits or lower prevalence rates of this disease. Older deer certainly have more. Now, there's a big question that comes in with this saying, hey, we understand that mature bucks are twice as likely to have this as mature does, but we understand a lot of places, deer in the landscape, there's almost always more than twice as many mature does out there as there are mature bucks. And that's very true. That's because of how we harvest deer. And this is one thing that we need to understand as hunters. We need to get after both sexes of deer. And in many cases, we need to harvest deer at much higher rates than we typically do. Across the country, only 41% of the hunters last year shot a single deer. Over half of the hunters in the U.S. didn't shoot a single deer. Only 18% shot more than one deer. That's pretty pathetic when you start thinking about all of the days that we spend deer hunting, and a lot of that's not that people aren't having as many opportunities. A lot of that, they're just choosing not to. And in fact, if you look specifically at Pennsylvania, we're even a little lower. Only 37% of our hunters shot a deer last year, and only 13% shot more than one. And I share those numbers with you because obviously we have bag limits much higher than that. But what that means is what we see across the U.S. is the average hunter. Of course, we want to shoot bucks. We like to shoot bucks. I get it. I like to shoot bucks too. But in many cases, somebody will shoot a buck, and then that's it. They won't shoot another deer. They won't shoot an antlerless deer, which then helps from a herd population standpoint. It will help balance that herd or reduce that herd. So what we need to convince hunters to do is just the simple need to harvest additional deer, both bucks and does. And if you can't eat all of those, there's a lot of needy families out there. 1 in 7 families in the U.S. are protein insecure today, which means they can benefit from additional venison. I know my family and I love to hunt. We harvest a lot of deer. We eat a lot of deer every year. But we always harvest at least 2 extra deer that we share with needy families or share with the church or share with the food bank. So I encourage all hunters. We can be heroes to society from this perspective in harvesting additional deer. We can also expect that some of our license money gets diverted from herd and habitat management. for CWD sampling and monitoring. And this is a very necessary thing. To give you some perspective on what's going on in Wisconsin, the DNR there spent over $50 million monitoring CWD and managing it and sampling it. And this is incredible. And this is no knock on the DNR there. Thank God they're doing this. But just think if they didn't have CWD and they could have spent that money instead on hunter access, land, habitat enhancement, land purchases, all of these other things the hunters would rather have spent it on that the DNR would rather spend it on. So this is an expensive thing. We need to realize CWD is very, very expensive to all agencies. We know the hunting participation rates can decline. I'm going to show you some data from Wisconsin because they are the first ones east of the Mississippi River to get this. This is no one. This is the number of hunting license sales the last year before they identified CWD. They identified the next year. This is how the hunting license sales dropped. By the next year, they recovered a little bit, but if we look over the next 10 years, they never did return to where they were. And we know we've all heard, we're losing hunters. Hunters are aging out. This is a real thing. So, but once CWD hits, that's not a good thing. Some people may say, you know what, if I don't have as many people hunting in my backyard, that's a good thing. And I'll argue that's not a good thing at all, because if we have fewer hunters, it means less money to manage wildlife, particularly from a deer hunting end. I showed you that 60% of all the funding we have in the hunting industry comes off the back of deer hunters. So fewer hunters leads to less money to manage wildlife, and fewer hunters leads to less advocates for hunting. There's only about 4% of the U.S. population today buys, or of the adult segment of it, buys a hunting license. Some people say it's my God-given right to hunt. I'll always be able to do it. I wish that was true, but that's not true at all. We don't get to do anything in the United States because 4% of us like it. We get to hunt today because about 80% of the public supports hunting, legal, ethical, regulated hunting. And they like that because they see that we follow the rules. And boy, so anything we can do to provide a good public image benefits hunters. And man, providing venison to needy families certainly fits that bill. There's also economic repercussions when you get CWD. In Missouri, when they first identified what was going on, land values lost $200 to $400 per acre. And this is because there's no way to decontaminate a site once we have it, at least not with current knowledge. Once the CWD is in the soil, it's there for years, and as Brian shared, possibly decades. So we lose land value. And I'm sharing all of these just to let you know these are the realities of this, so that we can fight hard every single day to limit the spread. We know that no state has won the CWD battle. While CWD prions remain there, the disease continues to spread. It continues to infect other deer. And this is how this is different from the mad cow version of this, where if a cow has it, it's not sharing it with another cow. It's unlike that with deer, though. If a deer has it, it can share it to another deer. And that's one of the things that makes this so dangerous. I'm going to share a few slides here now. These are similar to what Brian did, just to kind of impress upon the point here of this. This is South Central Iowa County, one of the main hotspots in Wisconsin. If you take a look back at 2002, and this is identified, let's just look at the blue solid line. This is just the adult males. Those that are 2.5 years and older. Only around 1 or 2% of those bucks had the disease. And look what happened after a few years of this being there. Look at that growth curve. Brian showed you this. This is what's becoming reality. In this case, 30% of the adult bucks had them. We can look at southeastern Richland County, 35% of the adult bucks had it by 2014. North central Iowa County, over 45% of the bucks. This is what we're trying to stop. And he showed you this is what the growth curves in Pennsylvania are starting to look like. Luckily, we're way to the left on these. But we're hitting to the point where if we don't slow this down dramatically very, very soon, we're going to end up to what you're seeing on the right here. So that's why all the steps the Game Commission has taken is to keep us from ending up exactly like Wisconsin and all those other states and provinces have. That's what's at stake here. So the implications for deer management from this end, well, we know that as we continue along this path, there's certainly going to be fewer mature bucks to appease hunters out there. There's going to be even lower deer densities. That's never an appealing thing. And there's going to be fewer disease-free deer. So if we do nothing, this is exactly where we're going to end up. And that's one of the reasons that we're doing these meetings and sharing this information, is to let hunters know what they can do to stop this and keep us from getting out to the right on this curve. So, all right, last thing here from this part of it before I end with some Pennsylvania specific stuff is CWD positive venison safe to eat? Now, should you eat it? Should you even get your deer tested? Well, according to both the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control, there's no evidence that humans can contract Creutzfeldt-Jakob, that's the human version of the prion disease, from eating CWD infected deer. However, they both strongly encourage hunters to not eat this. Do not eat venison from a deer unless you get a satisfactory test back from this. And the only way to know if this deer likely has it or not is to get it tested. That's why the Pennsylvania Game Commission encourages hunters to get deer tested. That's why we strongly at the National Deer Association encourage hunters to do this. And that's why we're also working to be able to get easy, low-cost testing for hunters across the whitetails range, to be able to do this. We don't want you to be able to eat this stuff. We want to follow the science for that. And you know what? Some people say, you know what? I've been eating venison for years. I'm going to continue. And that's obviously your choice. And I believe in America, you should have some choices like that. However, if we're going to follow the science and try to do what's best for us and for society, even if you choose to eat it, I just encourage you a couple slides ago to donate some venison to needy families. Are you going to donate venison to a family that has a little boy there that might love to eat that venison, or a little girl, or a little family down the street, or to somebody in your church? So I hope not. I hope that you will provide those heads to be sampled, follow the Game Commission's guidelines with that, and their encouragement to get this stuff sampled, so we understand exactly what the prevalence rate is, we understand exactly where it is, and we do everything possible to keep it from spreading even farther. So, all right, so you kind of know what the disease is now. You kind of understand the direct applications to us as hunters. I'm going to end with some slides from Pennsylvania just to show you what really is at stake here, and kind of talk about our hunting seasons and how this fits in around the country. So you understand we're not alone in this. We're not being picked on in Pennsylvania by the Game Commission. Anybody who has CWD is experiencing these similar things. But as hunters, in Pennsylvania, we like to take it out in the Game Commission a lot of times and complain about things. But I'm going to show you a few slides here just to highlight really how lucky we are from a deer hunting perspective. I'm going to share with you some national data. This is all from the 2019 into 2020 hunting season, because that's the most recent season that the hunting data is available from all states across the whitetails range. Here in Pennsylvania now, we do have our data analyzed from last hunting season, but not all states have done that yet. So this is the most recent season we have available. If you take a look nationwide, top 5 states from an antler buck harvest standpoint, Texas usually leads this list, right? They're a huge state. They got a lot of deer. They got a lot of deer hunters. But Pennsylvania is always on the top 5 list for total numbers of antler bucks that are harvested. And actually, we can take a look at this and look at a buck harvest on a per square mile basis. This provides a little more apples to apples comparison. Allows the smaller states to compare against Texas and some of the larger ones. If we take a look at the antler buck harvest per square mile in these states, we find out that we actually do even better in Pennsylvania. We're up to number 2 on the list. Michigan is the only state in the country that kills more bucks per square mile than we do. Well, how about if we take a look at the antlerless side? Because this is really where the rubber meets the road. If we don't harvest an adequate number of antlerless deer each year, deer herds grow too high, then all kinds of bad things happen to the deer, to the habitat, to other wildlife species there, and then certainly from a disease standpoint. Well, from an antlerless side, we're even a little bit higher on this list. We're number 2 in total numbers of deer. And then if we look at this also on a per square mile basis, we're right at the top again. Delaware is the only state in the country that shoots more. And if you take a look here, look at 4 of the states here. If you know a little bit about geography, we're talking about, mid-Atlantic states, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey. We are really in a sweet spot in the country relative to having very productive deer herds. This allows us to kill a lot of deer, which is good. We love to put venison in the freezer here in Pennsylvania. But it also means that as hunters, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to shoot a lot more deer, particularly from the antlerless side in a given year, than hunters in a lot of other states, particularly states that have much lower deer densities. So this is a good thing, but it also requires a little bit from us. So kind of a summary here, I'm going to say, Pennsylvania rocks. If you take a look from a deer standpoint, from a hunting season standpoint, the Keystone State, we are one of only 3 states to shoot greater than 300,000 deer annually. In that 2019 to 20 season, we harvested 3.6 antler bucks per square mile. Michigan is the only state that shot more. For the 11th year in a row, over half of our antler buck harvest was at least 2.5 years old. So actually it was the oldest that it's ever been. Hunters love this. We have the most balanced age structure we've ever had. In most cases, that's a really, really good thing. Comes into a problem though when we start talking about disease, and particularly a disease that is more prevalent in these older bucks. So, what do we need to do? Do we need to stop harvesting these bucks? That's not the answer. The answer is to continue to harvest bucks. We obviously shoot a lot of them, continue to do that, but also continue to harvest them at even a higher rate, as well as harvesting our antlerless deer at a higher rate. You saw on this slide that Delaware is the only state that actually shot more than us. from an antler side, but this bottom bullet here, if we take a look at this, there's not a single state in the whole country that shot more deer per square mile than Pennsylvania. We are at the top of the list with this. And the thing is, we have room to go even more. As I said, only 13% of our hunters shot more than one deer. In Pennsylvania, we have a higher hunter density than any state in the country. We have about 22 hunters per square mile. That's a lot. The whole Northeast only has about 11 per square mile. The Southeast only averages about 6 per square mile. The Midwest averages 6 per square mile. And the Western US only averages 1 per square mile. So here in Pennsylvania, 22 hunters per square mile. That's a lot of hunters in the woods, and we really get after the deer, as obvious, but we have room to do even more. And we need to do even more. We need to do more to help our deer management program. We need to shoot more deer to help from a disease end. And then let's take those and help feed some needy families. So current status then, we know that there is much concern about the increased spread of CWD. We're seeing it in new states. We're seeing it in new areas within existing states. And there's much concern about the future of wildlife, our deer herds, our deer hunting, and all wildlife management, because so much of other wildlife management comes off the backs of having a healthy deer herd and having deer hunters that are out there getting after them. So is CWD the end of deer hunting? Well, I'm an optimist. I'm going to say no, it's not. But we absolutely must be vigilant to minimize transmission into existing areas. We need to prevent introduction of CWD into new areas. We need to support research to help us learn more about this disease and the Game Commission's efforts with this. We have a tremendous amount at stake here. We have a great opportunity to engage our hunters. I said we have more hunters than anybody else per square mile. That means more help on the landscape to be able to do this. So I hope that I have shared with you what this means to us as hunters. I hope I've shared with you how good we actually have it right now, how important deer are, and how important it is to safeguard these. And then with that, I'll end with showing you that we do have information on our website on our recommended practices for deer hunters. This is available at thedeerassociation.com. You can go and grab this, tell you what you can do, because I believe that we absolutely can beat it and that hunters can wake up every day and do something to fight this. You can look at our CWD Resource Center. You can look at our Fight CWD social media campaign and know that there's absolutely something we can do. And we are proud to partner with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. And up next, Andrea Corman is going to be able to share with you, okay, now that you see what is here and what is at stake, exactly what the Game Commission is doing to help us battle this disease and how you can do your part for that. This is my email address. We're going to do a Q&A when we're done, so you can ask any questions, but you are welcome to contact me at any point after this. If there's something I can do to answer questions or help, I am glad to do that. So feel free to jot this down and contact me anytime. And with that, Nick, I'll turn it back over to you and look forward to hearing Andrea share exactly what the Game Commission is doing here to allow us to beat this thing.
Thank you, Kip. Great job. You don't even need a moderator here tonight, folks. Everybody is staying right on time with their presentations, which certainly makes my job easier. Kip did reference it. Questions and answers, please put them in the Q&A tab. We do have one question in the chat, which we will address, but please put them in the Q&A if you don't mind. We'd appreciate that. And so with that, and hang in there, folks. We are kind of heading down the home stretch here, but you've got some great information ahead of you. From Andrea Corman, who's the CWD biologist for the Pennsylvania Game Commission. She's going to tell you what the Game Commission is doing about this disease. So Andrea, it's on you. The floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Nick. All right, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history of CWD in Pennsylvania, and then talk about the management actions that we've implemented to minimize the effects of CWD on Pennsylvania deer and elk populations. So CWD surveillance has been ongoing since 1998, and as of today, over 107,000 deer and nearly 1,600 elk in Pennsylvania have been tested for CWD. In 2003, the first Pennsylvania interagency CWD response plan was developed by agencies like the Game Commission, Pennsylvania Department of Ag, USDA, and many others. This was also the beginning of statewide sampling, where previously only clinical suspects were tested for CWD. In 2006, authority over the captive cervid industry was transferred from the Game Commission to Pennsylvania Department of Ag. So in Pennsylvania, CWD is managed under 2 different agencies, which can be challenging. In 2012, we had our first detections of CWD in Pennsylvania. And then in July of last year, our agency response plan was approved by the Board of Commissioners, and we began implementing it that fall. Now, going back to our first detections, in October 2012, CWD was detected in a captive facility represented by this yellow star in Adams County, which resulted in the creation of Disease Management Area, or DMA1. And then 1 to 2 months later, 3 hunter-harvested free-ranging deer represented by the red dots tested positive in Blair and Bedford counties, which resulted in the establishment of DMA2. DMA3 was then created in 2014 after CWD was detected in 2 captive facilities in Jefferson County. Then DMA1 was dissolved in 2017 after going 5 consecutive years without any additional CWD detections. Then in 2018, DMA4 was created after CWD was detected in a captive cervid facility in Lancaster County. So within DMAs, there is a ban on removing high-risk parts, feeding deer, and using urine-based attractants. So even with those restrictions in place and increased surveillance, DMAs have continued to expand and more deer test positive each year. If the trajectory of the disease increases in Pennsylvania like it has in other states, the infection rate in portions of Blair, Bedford, and Fulton counties will likely exceed 30% in the next 1 to 2 decades, and it will continue to spread throughout the state. So the revised and updated response plan establishes a framework for managing CWD in Pennsylvania. Currently, as you've heard, the best management strategy to control CWD is to reduce deer abundance in infected areas to slow the rate of disease transmission and remove infected individuals from the landscape. Many of the objectives and strategies in the plan focus on ways to limit spread of the disease and prevent it from becoming established in new areas. So the response plan identifies 4 different types of management areas. There's disease management areas, the established area, enhanced surveillance units, and containment zones. Each of these is associated with different objectives and strategies. So these are our current disease management areas, or DMAs. And a DMA is created when new CWD detections are found in either a free-ranging or captive deer, regardless of proximity to any previous detections. A 10-mile buffer is placed around each detection, and that 10 miles is used because it encompasses the dispersal distances of most deer in Pennsylvania, and so that includes the area where a positive deer may have been spreading prions. Depending on the location of the detection, it might have no effect. It might result in the expansion of an existing DMA, or it could cause a new DMA to be created. So the purpose of a DMA is to reduce human-assisted spread of CWD. Sampling is also increased to detect CWD spread from known locations. So in these areas, feeding deer is prohibited, as is the use of natural urine-based attractants. Both of those cause increased congregation of deer and can therefore increase transmission of the disease. High-risk parts cannot be taken outside the DMA. And I'll define high-risk parts more later, but generally we're talking about the brain and spinal column. We also increased antlerless allocations in wildlife management units that have had CWD detections to reduce deer abundance and limit spread of the disease. And head collection bins are provided for hunters to submit deer heads for testing to increase sampling and surveillance. So next is the established area. We currently only have one found within DMA2. An established area is characterized by CWD detections that contiguously occur across a large area and consistently from year to year. So in an established area, CWD is considered established within the deer population, and coupled with environmental contamination poses a long-term threat to neighboring areas. So this area covers primarily Blair, Bedford, and Fulton counties, or in terms of wildlife management units, it would be 4A and a portion of 2C. And over 90% of our positives have come from this area. So in the established area, the extent of CWD infection is more significant than in other areas. And the goal here is to maintain sample prevalence at or below 5% and minimize the movement of high-risk parts to other areas. So that 5% was chosen because data from other states and models show that once that threshold is crossed, disease prevalence accelerates drastically, which makes management of the disease even more difficult. So to reach this goal, reducing deer abundance is the primary management strategy for this area. This is done through increased hunter harvest and helps reduce the potential for disease transmission and removes those additional positive deer from the landscape. Due to the degree of infection in this area, transport of high-risk parts outside the established area is prohibited. This is a new regulation for this year. Other DMA restrictions also apply, so there's no feeding deer or using natural urine-based attractants within the established area. Next, we have enhanced surveillance units. These are individual areas within disease management areas that are created when there's a new CWD detection in either free-ranging or captive deer that is greater than 5 miles from any other past detection. So an enhanced surveillance unit is created by using an approximately 3 to 5 mile radius buffer around this isolated detection. So that buffer was chosen to balance the need to focus surveillance efforts in the area where the infected deer was likely to have traveled and still be able to collect enough samples to meet the target sample size. In these new areas, extent and sample prevalence of CWD are unknown, and each enhanced surveillance unit has an associated DMAP unit. So to the public, this will look and function just like any other DMAP unit. So the units in pink are the 8 that were created last year. And the purpose of these units is to determine the extent and sample prevalence of CWD through increased sampling. This is primarily achieved through hunter harvest. The target sample size for each unit is approximately 250 to 300 deer to give us an adequate confidence that we could detect the disease if it is in a small percentage of the population within that unit. Hunters can purchase up to 2 additional antlerless tags per unit to help meet those sample goals. So last year, hunter participation was relatively good, with all but 1 unit selling at least 50% or more of available permits. We also exceeded our target sample size in 4 of those units. And in the units where we didn't reach that 250 samples, we still received good numbers, and the samples from those units will still be informative. And last but not least, we have containment zones. So these are the smallest geographic areas consisting of an approximately 1 mile radius buffer around the location of a new CWD detection. So the size is based on a deer's average home range and includes the individuals it was most likely to have come in contact with and potentially infect. This area represents the best option to suppress the impact of an initial CWD detection. And this is just an example map with a hypothetical enhanced surveillance unit and containment zone, so you can see just how small a containment zone really is. And our purpose here is to prevent the establishment and spread of CWD by removing the most high-risk deer from the area immediately surrounding a CWD detection. Management strategies that are applied in these areas can include increased hunter harvest and targeted removals to ensure that the deer most likely to have come in contact with that positive detection are removed. Given the small scale of these areas, communication and outreach to landowners for hunting access also occurs as a regular part of the process. And targeted removals do not occur unless we have permission from the landowner. So moving on to some of our other management strategies. We already know that it's unlawful to remove or export high-risk cervid parts from a DMA or the established area. It is also unlawful to import these parts from any state or province outside Pennsylvania. That is also new this year. High-risk parts include the head, and more specifically, the brain, eyes, lymph nodes, and tonsils, along with the spinal cord and spleen. So these parts are considered high risk because prions concentrate in high densities in these locations. The importance of these regulations is to prevent people from dumping these high-risk parts on the landscape in an uninfected area, possibly contaminating the soil in that area or exposing healthy deer or elk to the disease. Now, I've mentioned reducing deer numbers to slow the rate of disease transmission and to remove diseased individuals from the landscape. So how exactly do we go about doing that? The best way is to increase hunter harvest, and in very specific situations, use targeted removals. So we can and have increased hunter harvest in several ways. So we can increase antlerless harvest at the wildlife management unit scale through antlerless license allocations, or at a smaller scale using DMAP permits in the enhanced surveillance units. Concurrent firearm seasons give hunters more flexibility to use these opportunities, and successful management of CWD cannot occur without hunters. Their cooperation is essential, and removing barriers to participation like limited time to hunt is one of the ways to do this. Targeted removals are an option in certain areas with specific objectives. These are very small scale operations carried out by wildlife professionals from USDA Wildlife Services and only occur post-hunting season. These efforts are heavily dependent on landowner participation, as removals, again, only occur on properties where access has been permitted. Our surveillance efforts are critical in detecting new cases of CWD and tracking the spread and sample prevalence of the disease. In addition to testing white-tailed deer, we test elk as well. Nearly all hunter harvested elk are tested, along with roadkill and clinical suspect elk. To date, no elk has tested positive, and no deer from within the elk management area have tested positive for CWD. But we have had over 700 CWD positive deer since the initial detection in 2012. For deer, we collect samples through a variety of methods, including hunter harvest from voluntary samples from head collection bins, which are only located within disease management areas, as well as hunter harvest samples collected from meat processors statewide. Contractors are also employed to collect roadkill deer from state and local roads within and around the perimeter of DMAs. Those are probably our most important samples. They are often the first indication that the disease is expanding into new areas. And we also collect clinical suspects statewide. So to help the public stay current with our sampling efforts, we have a new dashboard that you can access from our main CWD page under CWD test results and surveillance data. It allows you to see our most up-to-date sampling data. So it consists of 3 pages. There are samples over time, sample prevalence, and sample statistics. And the sample prevalence page you see here contains a series of filters and maps to provide information at different scales. We're actually working with Department of Ag to develop one showing information for the captive industry, and that should be available to the public relatively soon. As part of the Game Commission's effort to effectively manage CWD and other wildlife diseases, the Wildlife Futures Program was started in 2019. The Wildlife Futures is a partnership between the Game Commission and the University of Pennsylvania's School of Veterinary Medicine, or Penn Vet. This program combines wildlife disease expertise and research from Penn Vet with the Game Commission's commitment to protecting, managing, and promoting wildlife in Pennsylvania. Wildlife Futures provides laboratory research and services to assist in the Game Commission's CWD efforts. The CWD Diagnostic Lab provides 2 types of testing, including a more rapid test that has helped improve turnaround times. So in other words, we can notify a hunter of their deer's test results within days rather than weeks. Some of the CWD research includes work to develop a rapid field test for CWD using biomarkers from infected deer, and development of procedures where dogs are trained to detect CWD in deer feces. So for more information on their research and other services, you can visit the Wildlife Futures website at this link. And we also have this phone number and email available for the public to use for any CWD related questions. So that's it for me, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Okay, we have reached the question and answer period. And if you have questions, please slip them in there. You still have a couple of minutes to do that. And as we get into this, I want to thank the speakers for doing a great job this evening and being impeccable in terms of staying on schedule. So thank you very much for that. Let's go ahead and get into the questions. And I'm going to deal with the one that ended up in the chat here. And this is from Lisa. And thank you, Lisa, for being on here. You mentioned right out of the gate that you're a non-hunter, so that's good. CWD should be of interest to hunters and non-hunters alike, so it's great to have you. And the question is, I'm not a deer hunter, but I have roughly 21 deer from different herds that regularly come to my property every day for feed. I started this last spring and continued to help them through winter. I spread feed around to give them space between feed, with as little stress as possible. What should I be looking out for? What shouldn't I be doing to safeguard these deer? I love my herd. They bring me great joy, but I don't want to harm them either. And so I'll start with this and then turn it over to some others and say, Lisa, the last part of your question is probably the most important, and that is what the deer give you great joy. What should I be doing to safeguard these deer? And I'm sorry to disappoint you with the answer, but the first thing would be not to feed them. You're actually not helping the deer by doing that. They're very well equipped to handle winter on their own with very little food. They can go a long time. And so the feeding, as you've heard through the presentation this evening, artificially congregates deer. So that's bad. And there are many other potential negative outcomes. So we all appreciate your love for the deer. We all have that same love. We have concerns for them as well, but feeding them is not a way to deal with that. And if anyone else would like to add to it, please go ahead.
I'll add, yeah, Lisa, thank you for being here tonight. And I mean, it seems like the most natural thing in the world that if we provide food that we're helping deer for the reasons Nick stated. It's not advisable to do that. But if you do want to help deer, there's other things you can do. It sounds like you obviously have a little bit of property. If those deer are on it, there's a lot of things that you can do in either the wooded situation or in an old field situation to be able to provide great food and cover for deer, to do much better for them during that time period. Deer are designed to survive winter very similar to the way bears are. They obviously don't hibernate, but they get as fat as they can during the summer and fall and live off that tissue fat throughout the winter. So they're not actually grown at that standpoint, but they survive winter by having more cover available to slow the use of that fat. I did my graduate work at the University of New Hampshire, and that's where there was a bunch of energetic work done there. And essentially what they found was that most deer go into winter with about a 90-day fat supply. And they define winter for deer much more so than us as humans. We get a few inches of snow or a little cold and, we start feeling bad for ourselves or think it's hard. We're talking, multiple inches of snow, a foot or more, with extremely cold temperatures, deer can survive about 90 days of that type of winter. So luckily in Pennsylvania, we have very few winters that ever approach anywhere near what a deer goes into from a fat supply. So you don't need to feel bad about not having that food there, but if you can do anything at all in the habitat around it to enhance the cover, that would do those deer far more good, and they'd appreciate that a whole lot more. So thank you for your efforts. So I'm trying to do something from a stewardship standpoint and help those deer.
Okay. Thanks, Kip. And also just note, if you happen to be in a CWD area, feeding deer is also unlawful, as has been described earlier. So this might not be the place to tell on yourself. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into the questions. This is a good one. Are the deer donated to butchers for sharing the harvest program tested for CWD, or do hunters have to remove the deer heads for testing before making the donation? Who would like to take a stab at that one?
I'll take a stab at it. I can tell you that if you are interested in donating your deer in the Southwest region or anywhere in the state, you're in a DMA, you can absolutely drop the head off and then hold on to whatever you've had butchered until you get those results back. That's part of the reason why we went with that very fast turnaround. And I do know that there are some hunters that do that. There are a few processors in our region who hold all of their hunter sharing the harvest deer until they've been sampled. But as far as I can tell, and I was actually during that talk, I was just on their website. I don't see anything on the Hunting Sharing the Harvest website that explicitly states that those deer are tested in Pennsylvania. And I do know that there are a couple of food banks that don't accept venison anymore because of that. So I think there is, some potential risk there, but I don't believe that there's anything in policy that indicates one way or the other whether or not all of those animals are tested.
Okay, thank you, Samara. Very nice job by all, so thank you very much for that. Curious about the percentage of annual harvest in the DMAs that is antlerless and how it has changed over the years since detection of CWD in 2012 compared to the changes in prevalence rates in DMAs. So that's a very complex and good question. Can you see that, Andrea? Sorry to throw it to you there.
I do see it. I don't know that I have the annual harvest numbers off the top of my head. In terms of, changes in sample prevalence, especially for the established area, and our response plan, that is based off of hunter harvested adult deer, adult being greater than 1 year of age. And I can tell you that has consistently increased from year to year. Last year it was around 8%. This year we're around 14%. So I can at least answer that part of the question.
Okay.
And I'll add to whoever that person is, that if that's something they wanted more specific information about, they could send a note to the info CWD email account.
I want to mention too that Andrea had mentioned the Wildlife Futures Program and Penn Vet, and you'll also see some others here on the screen. We've got Scott Weber with us tonight and Eric Gagne. Thank you guys for being here. Also ready to potentially answer questions that you might have about that partnership. Next question. It seems as though commercial deer farms are a major component of this. What is the Department of Ag doing? I've not read anything related to the commercial standpoint taking action. And so I'll just say initially, yeah, you saw in earlier presentations that CWD occurs on deer farms, and it occurs outside of deer farms. And we talked about the various ways that CWD can be transported by hunters and also by just the moving of deer. So as far as specifically what the Department of Ag is doing, does somebody want to take a more specific stab at that, or we don't have anyone? Oh, go ahead, Andrea.
I can speak a little to that because I've been working with Department of Ag in developing a dashboard similar to the one that we have for the Game Commission. And so I've learned a little bit more about how they handle some of these things. So I believe it was just last year, they created what's called the Core Captive Management Zone. And that is very similar to our established area. It's almost the exact same area. We kind of have the same problem in the same place where a lot of our positive detections are occurring. And so they have certain restrictions in place in that area in terms of what can be moved around, where it can move to, certain testing criteria, all of that kind of stuff in that area. And then if a facility tests positive outside of that area, there are certain quarantines that are put in place. They'll also do a trace back to see what facility that positive deer might have come from, and then quarantine that facility in case it came in contact with any other individuals. So they do a lot of tracking and testing to try to make sure that, you know, they keep it as under control as they can.
And I'll just add that the person who asked the question, if you go to the Department of Ag website and use their little search bar and put in herd certification, that'll give you information about the program that they have for managing their cervid facilities in the state.
Okay. Anybody have any final questions they want to get into the question box? If
So
not,
I do have something I can add to the antlerless harvest from my super secret informant here. And WMU 4A, the antlerless harvest remained at about 2/3 of the total harvest, both before and after CWD. So there you go.
we even have double secret informants. This is great. It's like phone a friend. Beautiful. Thank you. Well, again, I want to thank our speakers. You all did a tremendous job. There is a nice compliment also in the chat feature if you want to check that out. And I want to thank the participants for coming and being concerned about this. We essentially, once we got rolling, everybody that joined, almost everybody stayed the entire time, which speaks, I think, to the quality of the presentations, which speaks to your interest in this. And it doesn't end here. Your education on this needs to continue. I think the Game Commission does a really great job of putting information out there. We try to do our part as a non-government agency partner to do the same. And so we're all trying to help here. And then, of course, Brian joining us from a federal perspective. So thank you very much for being here. If you want to make sure your friends see this, this is recorded. So if there's someone that you know that should see this and they weren't able to be here this evening, look for that recording to be posted and they'll get a chance to see it. So with that, thank you again, everybody, for your time this evening. Take care.
Thank you.